And until the Conservative Party starts to get serious, it's at real risk of bringing about that hellish coalition where Nicky Sturgeon finds herself, oddly enough, the Deputy Prime Minister of a country that she wants to break up, of a country that she wants to destroy. I mean, how bizarre and barbaric will that be? Right? Boris, get a grip. Get back to delivering, right? You delivered Brexit. Now it's time to deliver these policies. Cement your legacy, mate. Otherwise, you're going to look like a complete and utter clown.
Currently, and I think I speak for a lot of Conservatives, Conservative Party members, we're not very happy with Boris Johnson and the current Conservative Party. They have had benefits like Ukraine, their response to Ukraine, but other things like increasing tax, the windfall tax, which I think is frankly anti-free market, the lockdown, Partygate. It's not a party you can be proud of, and this shows through the polls if you look at what the British people think. Again, with defence, they're happy. With Ukraine, they're happy. But when you look at inflation, when you look at the economy in general, when you look at when you look at housing, they don't seem to be happy. What do you think about the current Conservative Party?
Well, I must say, I campaigned heart and soul to put Boris Johnson in number 10 in 2019 against Jeremy Corbyn. I think many people did, right? And many millions voted for the very first time for a Conservative Party, right? People like my family who have been Labour through and through. You cut them open and the red rosette would be there, right? Like, I come from a mining family. And for them to vote Tory, well, hell, that just goes to show how seismic that election was, right? That election in which their party, the Labour Party, turned round and said, you stupid pleb, right? You didn't know what you were voting for. We're going to have a second referendum. To hell with your views on immigration, you bigot, right? To hell with your views on self-identification and women's rights, you transphobe, right? There are so many isms and phobias with the modern-day Labour Party bandied about and often thrown directly at working class people and working class communities that once voted Labour in overwhelming numbers. You could have put a red rosette on a donkey, Jess, in County Durham, and it would have won with an overwhelming majority. So for them, that was seismic, that was massive. And the promise of Brexit, the promise of Boris Johnson, and the two are of course linked. Because I don't think, by the way, you would have got one without the other. I think Boris Johnson saved Brexit, and I will always be grateful to him for that, because I think that the democratic outcry, the anti-democratic outcry of that vote, our biggest for anyone or anything, being overturned, I think that would have been hell for democracy. I think we would have seen people on the streets. I think we would have seen people saying, I'm not voting ever again. And it would have done incredible damage to the social fabric of this country and our trust in politics, in our institutions, and, of course, ultimately our politicians. But he hasn't, and, putting aside Ukraine, putting aside the pandemic, which, by the way, I supported the first lockdown, but then the other two I didn't, and I thought it was a mistake. I really did. I thought what he did was a mistake then. But he got us out sooner than most nations, Jess, right? So thank God we had Boris and not Sakir or Jeremy Hunt, or God knows we'd probably still be in lockdown right now. But that promise of Brexit and Boris said that actually the economy would work for people. There wouldn't be tax rises. Well, there have been. He keeps telling where the civil service is too big. Well, Boris, you've got an 8-seat majority, love. What you waiting for? On so many issues there have been. It just seems like the Human Rights Act, right? They've taken us out of the European Court of Human Rights, allowing us in this country for the first time in a couple of generations being able to have genuine border control by removing us from the European Court on Human Rights. They've been promising this for ages, Jess, a British Bill of Rights. But they don't do it. They're all talk. They're all bravado. They're all bluster. I'm getting sick of talk. I want a bit of action now. Thank you very much. So, on all of these issues, it just feels like a constant drip, drip, drip of disappointment after disappointment after disappointment. And people rightly feel really let down. So that's what I'd say. I am pro Boris, right, to a large extent. As I say, I thank him for Brexit. As I say, I thank him for defeating Jeremy Corbyn. Imagine this country under Jeremy Corbyn. Diane Abbott as Home Secretary. Hell's bells. So I thank him for all of these things. But I do think he needs to get a grip. He needs to recapture the narrative. Or right now, he's looking like a lame duck, and that's only going to get worse. Before long, there's a few Tories in there that know how to use a firearm, Jess, because they're from rural communities. They might be coming after the lame duck before long if he's not too careful.
So, on the topic of immigration, the British public aren't happy about how the Tories have handled immigration. You mentioned the European Court of Human Rights and how that's preventing us from controlling our borders. Do you think the Tories have handled immigration both legal and illegal? Do you think they've done that well?
No. I am supportive of what we've done for Ukrainian refugees, right? I am supportive to a large extent of what we've done for the people of Hong Kong, right? We promised them it would be a different regime from the Chinese regime. As you now know, that hasn't been the case. China is very much has its boot on the throat of Hong Kong and its people. And saying to British nationals overseas, you've got your passport, come here, and numbers of them have. But Jess, you mentioned the housing crisis, right? We haven't got houses. You mentioned healthcare crisis. You cannot see a GP. You've got people going without cancer screenings. You've got people that are unable to see a GP in person. We cannot just have this untrammeled free-for-all from Europe or elsewhere. We just can't do it. We haven't got the public resources. We haven't got the housing. And I just wonder where the hell people are going to go. Because they're going to want to live in London, Jess, right? Most people that come here are ultimately headed for London. Well, London's rent prices, even over since the pandemic, have massively spiked. People are really struggling. And, giving billions after billions to Ukraine and stuff like that. And I'm thinking the Prime Minister, Jess, even went out to Ukraine and missed a Levelling Up conference in Doncaster. I'm not sure that the optics of that are very good at this time. I'm really not. Because this is a generation-defining cost of living crisis, right? I've not experienced it in my lifetime. You've not experienced it in your lifetime. This is looking worse than the financial crash, right? It's massive. We cannot just say, right, let's help every Tom, Dick or Harry from around the world. Let's help, whoever from Afghanistan or Egypt who's in Calais coming over in a dinghy, an unseaworthy vessel, that we then say, oh, the RLNI border force, they can scramble over and give them a taxi ride across, and then we'll give them board and benefits and put them up in a four-star even hotel, right? Yet there are people in this country saying, I cannot afford to pay the mortgage. I'm going to lose my house. And we can't afford to help them. Do you see there are only so many things we can do. We are not the world's benefit system. We are not there to help the rest of the world. I tell you what, controversial view, but let's just stop bombing countries around the world, Jess, and then maybe we wouldn't have as many people coming here, right? There wouldn't be so much instability around the world maybe if we had intervened far fewer times throughout our history, right? If Tony Blair hadn't gone hell for leather and so on and so forth. We cannot help the world. We need to help people here at home. that old saying, charity starts at home. It's very true. Rings true for most people. So I don't think the British people are getting what they wanted on immigration, and I do think that this is going to become a seismic issue at the next election where people say, well, I am so disillusioned with the Conservative Party that you start to see, Jess, in those seats that were won that I spoke about earlier for the very first time in the so-called Red Wall, you start to see people saying, I'm so disillusioned, I'm not going to vote. Or I vote for Richard Tice in the Reform Party or Lawrence Fox in the Reclaim Party, whoever. But they say, I'm not voting Conservative. And that allows the Labour Party to get through again, to get back into power in those seats. What a stupid thing for the Conservative Party to do with a Home Secretary like Priti Patel, who I think is the most robust Home Secretary that we've had in this country since goodness only knows who, right? So until they get a grip of this, I think it's going to become a real, serious, as it once was, mind, electoral issue for the Conservative Party.
I think we need to focus on the cost of living crisis. It's like my sister, for example. She doesn't really care about politics. She knows a bit about what's happening with Ukraine, but she does know about prices going up, about bills going up, and that's what matters to her. I think this is what matters to the British public. How do you think we should deal with the cost of living crisis?
I think you've actually got to be honest with people, right? That you can't just inflate people's pay packets, right? You can't just do that, because actually that in turn ends up making inflation higher. That in turn pushes up the prices and makes things more expensive to procure because you've got to pay people more, right? That affects everything from, I don't know, it could be, let's take an Amazon delivery, right? It pushes up the cost of hiring workers at Amazon. It pushes up the cost of hiring the delivery bloke or woman at the other end of that transaction. And it pushes up so much else, right? And ultimately ends up making things more expensive for you. So we've got to be honest with people. We've got to set out, I think, sound economics. We've got to start saying, look, there isn't a magic money tree. If there was, we've well and truly ransacked it, Jess, and ran away with the proceedings and spent it all elsewhere. So we've got to be honest. But I think you've got to make this country competitive. And I don't think you do that, Jess, through hiking taxes. I don't think you do that through punishing people by making new levies, the so-called social care levy. Is it hell a social care levy? It won't be spent on social care. It'll be gobbled up by the NHS, that bottomless pit, and spent unwisely. Jess, it's probably hiring a few diversity managers in the NHS, right? So I'm not convinced by that argument. I think you've got to, in this post-Brexit, this unfrozen moment, we're coming through the pandemic, we're still trying to make the most of Brexit, to actually hike taxes at this moment sends a signal to the world that says we are not open for business, we are not competitive, we are not a flexible labour market that you can get involved in, that you can spend your money in. We're a high tax European social democrat model. I think that would be the wrong message to send to the world. We've got to say, look, we're a buccaneering, free trading, we're open for business, we want jobs aplenty, we're a flexible labour market, we're not like France, we don't strike every 2 minutes, right? We've got to be sound on taxes, sound on money, and send a strong signal to the world that Britain is back and open for business. And I think the Tories are squandering that opportunity, Jess. I really, really do. And breaking some manifesto commitments in the process.
I think it's funny how, despite the Tories giving into quite socialist ideas, like the windfall tax or just increasing tax in general, the socialists seem to want more, and just Labour Party in general seem to want more. For example, I recently saw a video of Zara Sultana wanting to raise the minimum wage to £15 an hour. Like, they don't understand economics completely. It's ridiculous. And I think it's kind of scary how many people of my generation and millennials as well believe these ideas. They think we should raise the minimum wage. They think the solution to government problems is more government action instead of the free market. How do you think we can combat that? Because I think it does come down to the electorate and their mentality. I think we have quite a paternalistic mentality that the government should do things for us, especially in the younger generations. How do you think we should combat that?
There's a jingle that I know off the top of my head, which makes me really sad, from the 1980s, and it went something like this. It says, "Too much money in circulation leads us directly to inflation. We'll count our blessings if we apply tight control of the money supply." And that jingle stuck in my head. But we're not saying anything like that these days. You know, Keynesianism is the creed of much of the civil service and the intellectual classes. And we've got to make the case again, Jess, right? Ronnie Reagan said that freedom is only ever one generation away from extinction, right? From being extinguished, something along those lines anyway. And that's absolutely right. So I think the Conservative Party, frankly, has been sat on its arse, right? And not making the case for conservatism, not making the case for capitalism, not making the case for sound money, sound economics. So people don't know about these things. I mean, Jess, you say to someone like Zara Sultana, well, why stop at 15, love? Why not put it up to 25? Why not 35? Why not 45? To hell with it. Let's have a £50 minimum wage. Why not? And you say, well, because that puts us in an inflationary debt spiral. And businesses can't afford to pay that. Small businesses, which are the bedrock, the backbone of the British economy, would be like, oh, well, that's my business gone. Goodbye. Brexit Britain looks like a basket case, like a North Korean basket case on the world stage. We start replicating policies that have been tried in Venezuela, for God's sake. Look at that. They can't put the lights on, Jess. They can't buy medicines. They're eating their own pets, and we are a pet-loving country. Try telling British people they're going to have to eat their own pets. They'd starve. The pets would be eating us. So all of these things are ridiculous. We've got to start being honest. We've got to start making the case. And we've needed to do, this is why I set up Reasoned, right? God's honest truth, hand on heart. Because we recognised that year on year, the trend was growing. The trend of believing that Jeremy Corbyn is the answer to everything, Jess, was growing. And you don't combat that by trying to out-left the left. You don't combat that by trying to out-green the Greens, the immiseration of the working class. You don't combat that by saying, well, I'll be more socialist than the other lot. Because I tell you what, Rishi Sunak's the most successful socialist chancellor since I think Clement Attlee was in office, right? So all of these things to me suggest that we need to be more robust and forthright in saying we are conservatives, in saying this is what we believe. If you don't like that, fine, but make your case. I will argue against it, right? I don't think you're evil, but I think you're wrong. And have that discussion, which is why Reasoned needs to get out and about in campuses and actually make the case, make the mission known, heard. Because it's this generation, Jess, it's the young generation, the next generation, that have a noose of debt tied around their neck like you wouldn't believe, right? And any minute now, someone's going to kick the stool from under them. And that's their prospects up just like that. And that's housing, that's jobs, that's your life prospects, your life chances. Kaput. Because we are falling for that trap of saying, well, we haven't been socialist enough, right? We haven't intervened enough in the economy. We haven't had a more activist state. Well, actually, we've seen around the world, history is littered with examples of where this gets us. Venezuela, Jeremy Corbyn and Owen Jones said that Venezuela was an alternative for Britain. They're eating their pets, right? That's the sort of thing, the case that needs to be made. And Conservatives don't do it. They tried it in Australia, Jess, where the Conservatives, who are the Liberal Party, oddly enough, but the Conservatives in Australia tried to out-green in green seats. They said, right, net zero by 2050, hunky-dory, we'll do that, yep. And in the cities, Liberal-leaning cities, the metropolitan Liberals, Jess, said, well, I'm just going to vote for the Green Party or independent candidates who are pro-green policies. I'm not going to vote for the Conservatives. If I want green, I'll vote green. Well, the Conservative Party in Great Britain and Northern Ireland needs to learn that lesson as well. Right? If they want socialists, they'll vote for the damn socialists.
I think there's a saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes. And I think currently right now...
I think it probably is repeating itself. Yeah. Right now.
Well,
right now.
I studied A-level history, and when we did the time of the 70s, look at the unions, the strikers, look at the cost of living crisis at that time. And then Thatcher came along. And when Thatcher came along, there's this well-known story that she threw, I think it was Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty on the table at a cabinet meeting. And she said, this is what... What do you think Boris Johnson's book would be if he had to do that?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think Boris Johnson's book would be Boris Johnson's autobiography, Jess. When he leaves office, I think that would be his book. Boris Johnson believes in Boris Johnson. I think he, as I say, going back, that sounds harsh. Many people won't be happy with me saying that, but I thank him for Brexit, but he does ultimately believe in Boris Johnson, the project of Boris Johnson. Look, Mrs. Thatcher was one of a kind. We don't have any of her like in the House of Commons today. That's for damn sure. So yeah, that's my answer, frankly.
If there was an election tomorrow, who do you think would win?
Good question. I really fear, and I don't mean to play the role of Mystic Meg here, but I fear that the Labour Party do well in England, right? And then they go into coalition with maybe the SNP or the Lib Dems or maybe both of them. And we end up with them fixing the electoral system, right? We're changing the electoral system so that they can lock the Tories out of power for goodness only knows how long. And I think that's a genuine prospect because I don't think the Tories are delivering, Jess. I don't think the Tories are acting like they say they're the people's government. Well, maybe so, but it's not the people of this country right now, right? You're not focusing on this country. So, yeah, that's what I fear. That's what I worry about. I think Labour are going to do really well in the next election because all of a sudden it's not, oh my God, if I vote Labour, I'm going to end up with Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott. It's going to be Sir Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, who are much more sensible, although still very much in the element of whackery and wokery. Sir Keir Starmer just can't bring himself to say that women don't have willies. All of these things are daft, but they're very serious when put into policy positions. So I fear that unless the Conservative Party gets up off of its arse, then we're all up Pooh Creek, Jess, without a paddle.
Do you think, last question, do you think there's still time for the Conservative Party to redeem itself? And how would they go about that?
I think there is. I think there is time for the Conservative Party to redeem itself. I think it has to get serious on things like house building, Jess. That's the only way that you can win over the next generation, by creating a generation of homeowners. It's what cemented Margaret Thatcher's wins right under the Right to Buy scheme. By the way, I think the Right to Buy scheme is one of the greatest policies ever devised. The real outrage with the Right to Buy policy was that we didn't replace the housing stock, Jess. That was the problem. We didn't reform planning legislation to actually say we can build more houses and don't talk to me about Greenbelt. You imagine Greenbelt with green rolling vistas and the sort of, you harken back to Jerusalem and England's green and pleasant lands. Jess, Greenbelt these days could mean disused car washes, right? That have a bit of bloody moss grown over them. Greenbelt is a distortion of the truth. It's like saying a man with a willy is a woman, right? It's not Greenbelt. So we need to reform planning law like that sort of thing and say Greenbelt has to mean genuine Greenbelt, right? It has to be green, how we all imagine it, those green rolling vistas, beautiful England. Fine, that's Greenbelt. Not disused car washes in London. So they need to get serious on that. They need to get serious on the economy. The taxes are too damn high. 70-year highs, Jess, you're talking. That's not conservative politics. Need to get serious on, I think we need to have a national conversation, Jess, about the NHS. I think that's going to get worse. And we need to get Northern Ireland out of the single market. We need to leave the European Court of Human Rights so we can actually have border controls and deliver on that promise of Brexit. That's 5 things that I can list. I could go on and on and on, but I don't want to bore your listeners. But they're 5 things that I think are incredibly important, Jess. And until the Conservative Party starts to get serious, it's at real risk of bringing about that hellish coalition where Nicky Sturgeon finds herself, oddly enough, the Deputy Prime Minister of a country that she wants to break up, of a country that she wants to destroy. I mean, how bizarre and barbaric will that be? Right? Boris, get a grip. Get back to delivering, right? You delivered Brexit. Now it's time to deliver these policies. Cement your legacy, mate. Otherwise, you're going to look like a complete and utter clown. That's my 10 pence.